above everything else. So what else
Yeah.
did you want to talk about before?
Um, okay, there's just a couple things.
Sure.
So one thing I wanted to lay out for people is I'm using these charts I've drawn, and people might wonder how I came up with the dates I'm using. So I just wanted to explain that real quick.
Sounds good.
Okay. So in my timelines I use, and this is just to explain the dates I've been citing for different events on here. And this all depends on personal conviction on different facts. The timeline could shift a little depending on how people feel about different things. And I'll give an example of what I mean, but for now, the starting point, I have Saul's reign in Israel from 1050 to 1010 BC, followed by David's reign from 1010 to 970 BC, followed by Solomon's reign from 970 to 931 BC. Those are pretty well accepted dates. Okay, so this is sort of an anchor point from which I work backwards to find the rest of the dates I refer to. So having Saul, David, and Solomon's reigns as a starting point, we use the 4th year of Solomon to go back to the time of the Exodus. Now, it was 612 years before the 4th year of Solomon that the Exodus occurred. And we know that from Josephus in his book Against Apian, Book 2, Chapter 2. And he gives us that information. And that's the real number involved. Now, a lot of people have noticed that in 1 Kings 6:1, it says that there were 480 years from the Exodus to the 4th year of Solomon, to the time that Solomon built the temple. In that reckoning there, the priest that wrote that, he was reckoning only the time that Israel was in the land and thriving and pleasing to God. He's only counting that time. So if you add the years of captivity when Israel fell to an enemy and was in captivity, if you add the years of their captivities through the judges to that 480, you arrive at the 612. So that places the Exodus at 1578. And that's going back from the established time of the reigns of Saul, David, and Solomon. So 612 years back from there places the Exodus at 1578. And that's interesting because that happens to be the time that a pharaoh in Egypt named Bebiank, he's a rather obscure pharaoh. We don't know much about him, but he reigned for 12 years and it ended in 1578, according to some Egyptologists. You'll find that there's another date put on him that is off just a little, like a couple years from that. But some Egyptologists date him 1590 to 1578. And I thought that's interesting. We have a pharaoh who died at the time of the Exodus, So I just think maybe that was the pharaoh of the Exodus. So I list Bebiank on the chart, and that lines up with the 1578. And then if you go forward 40 years from that, see, the Exodus would have occurred and they would have wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Then the conquest of Canaan would have begun under Joshua in 1538. And that's important because they go to Jericho and destroy Jericho in 1538. And according to traditional dating that would follow this verse in 1 Kings 6:1, the 480 years, they followed that verse straight up for placing the time of the Exodus, and that pushes the whole time frame forward a certain amount. And we ended up having problems archaeologically with Jericho lining up with the Hebrew record. They said, well, this destruction was similar to that described in the Bible, but the time is not right, you know. And they can tell from pottery mainly the time of the destruction, and I think it's dated at 1540, and I have a date here of 1538. That's so close you can't complain, man. That's
Yeah.
So there's a couple archaeological dilemmas with the Hebrew history that line up, but this one here, the destruction of Jericho, definitely, it lines up now with this timeline. So that's just some interesting things about the timeline there. And then going back from there, trying to get exact dates as much as I can. Back from there, we can go 430 years from the Exodus back to Abraham. And this is another number that's been difficult to pinpoint by scholars. They've debated this out because well, it's a heavy issue, but there's just indications of different time frames in different Bible verses. But you'll notice on the chart, I have 430 years, Exodus 1240 in the Septuagint, the LXX. You have to read the Septuagint reading that faithfully preserves the text there, because it says it was 430 years that was spent with Abraham and the patriarchs in Canaan, and also the time down in Egypt. So there's a textual issue there that's caused some confusion with certain scholars over the years, but it's 430 years from the Exodus back to the time that Abraham came into Canaan, and that places Abraham then at 2008 BC. So you'll notice that you never can line Abraham up with Hammurabi, the king of Babylon, who some think is the king of Shinar in Genesis 14, but I can't agree with that. The chronologies don't line up for that. So that's just an interesting thing. And really, that's an example of where an individual could decide they would adjust this timeline. Like if they really think Hammurabi's described in Genesis 14, then they can kind of realign this stuff accordingly. This can all be shifted around depending on the individual Bible student, but I think I have everything in where it should be. From there, once you're to Abraham, I mean, you can use the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11 and 12, and you can sort of piece it all the way back to get the rest of the dates on the chart. But that's how I arrived at the dates I have here. And if people disagree and have a different date for the Exodus because of their own research, then that's fine, but they would have to kind of adjust all of this around their date for the Exodus,
Mm-hmm.
And so everything would kind of shift. So it's just something people have to think about. And once you get enough, really, once you can get from the 4th year of Solomon back to the Exodus, then the rest you can figure out pretty easy. But people have struggled putting together a timeline for the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
And
I think a timeline, as well as a very thorough map, which you've also put together, is a very good reference to help. I think help accelerate a lot of people from understanding this, because I know you've done so. I mean, you've done so much research on this stuff, figuring out these charts and stuff, and I've it took me a while to kind of come to understand what the Old and New Testament is about. There is no doubt, like I think having a chart available will be extremely helpful as a reference. And one of the biggest things you learn in education, or at least one of the things I've learned, is that visual aids when it comes to learning have proven to be extremely helpful compared to anything else, even over like audio and kinesthetic stuff. Having a visual representation, I think, is going to be very helpful for anybody that's trying to understand what's going on.
Yeah,
So,
speaking of that, I use these charts in my videos, and people watching them might want a copy of the chart. They might want it on file, a picture file for their computer, and
mhm.
you can pull it up and open it up with like Windows Photo Viewer and zoom in and read it and stuff like that. So if people watching the videos want a copy of these 4 charts that I've drawn, then just email me. My email will be linked in the description to the video below, but it's also available at my channel. If you just go to the About section, my email's there. So I'll be, I'm totally willing if somebody sends me an email and just request the charts, just put charts in there or something, and I'll email back those picture files and they can have them. So that'll help people do research on this stuff. A little visual aid. They'll see things that make them curious, make them open the Bible to that part and do some research to see what I'm talking about, And that's really where people will learn if they try to confirm the different things I'm laying out here and look into it and research it, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I see, So there's a lot in these charts.
Sounds good.